Welcome back to Night Mine, friends. And welcome back to another installment of one of my October specials, Monster Hunt. Because what else do crazy, reckless people like us do around this time of year? We don't run from monsters. We track them down, get up close and personal, shake their hands, and tell them how much we appreciate their work. And this year is no different. I've assembled a list of terrors to hunt down that, while being pretty awesome on their own, have revealed some really surprising secrets to me while I conducted research for our field investigation. If you're feeling a bit burned out on the same old monsters and pop culture faces this Halloween, you can start to cheer up. I think I've got enough fresh blood to bring you back to life. And in case you're new to the October Expedition crew, last year's Monster Hunt ought to help you really get used to finding new creatures. Or if you're already a bit of a researcher yourself, give you new information about old friends. With that little intro out of the way, let's get rolling. You know the deal. Grab the flashlights, your weapons, and all the spare camera batteries you have. It's time for a monster hunt. Last year, we spent the night chasing down 4 targets, and while I would have liked to do the same thing this time, I have to put aside my greed and instead listen to my own channel motto this October: quality over quantity. Tonight, we're going after 3 monsters instead of 4, but the territory spanning 2 of them is so deep, we don't really have time to match last year's record. Believe me, it's going to feel like we've covered 4 by the end of the night. Our first destination, like stop number 1 in Monster Hunt 2016, takes us outside the United States, but not too far from our own familiar ground. According to some sources, the best place to start hunting would be around bodies of water in Mexico City, but really, any sort of lonely coast where a river or lake in Southern America might be the place. It's a very humbling experience to stand by the water. Oceans, lakes, rivers, and even ponds have a sort of resonance to them which impresses upon a person just how small they are. Some people say that bodies of water hold energy, and it's for this reason we can be so emotionally moved by standing on the coast. It would make sense then that riversides and beaches also trap highly negative spiritual energy in the ebb and flow of their tides. Experts say that ghosts and phantoms aren't much more than moments of major emotional impact that leave scars on the invisible world. Bring these 2 concepts together, the brilliance of a beach and the crippling pain of tragedy, and you have a moment in time that will ripple through the air for ages, washing over those who pass by on the beach like seawater drowning the sand. And even if you find this sight beautiful, it's not a pleasant kind of story that we're after. According to some variations of the legend, it's also not a very pleasant kind of spirit. Perhaps we would be better off looking at a much rockier, harsher riverside as we begin. It's not quite certain where in time the story of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, actually begins. Some people tell the story as a period piece of the 17 and 1800s in Mexico, describing a woman named Maria of lower-class society who became involved with a man of high class. Others claim it's the true end to Doña Marina, an Aztec woman who served as an intermediary between the Aztec Empire and Herman Cortez, a Spanish conquistador that she also served as a mistress. No matter what version you hear, the essential plot of the tale remains the same. La Llorona was a beautiful young woman of low standing in society who became romantically involved with a man of high class and power. She bore his children in secret, often cited to be twins, and even though she knew better than to expect fair treatment from her lover, she hoped he would eventually marry her or take pride in their affair. Eventually, something occurred involving the man of high society that infuriated or terrified Maria, as she took her children to a body of water, sometimes a lake, sometimes a river, occasionally the ocean. There she killed the children, stabbing them in the heart with a dagger, drowning them, or doing both. Distraught, Maria cried, my children," as if somebody else had murdered them, and then kills herself in the same spot, sinking into the water. Maria ends up outside the gates of heaven, where she is asked by a guardian spirit where her children are. She admits they are not with her, and she doesn't know where they might be. Maria is told that until she finds them, she cannot enter the gates, and so she returns to Earth, knowing very well what happened to her children. Still, she wanders the shore, weeping and crying out in hopes of someday finding them so her spirit can rest. What happens from here is up to the person telling the story, according to what they've been told. In some accounts, Maria is still in the state that she was left. She is merely La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, looking for the children she killed during a moment of pure insanity, and because they can't be found, it's her lonely, miserable ghost that you've come across. Others believe that Maria's spirit has become so confused and restless that she no longer recognizes who her children actually are or their age. She'll take anyone's kids, or someone who looks young enough, dragging them with her into the water where she remembers crossing over to the other side herself, unwittingly drowning innocent people again in the process. Then, there are those who tell a version of the tale that really brings it into Monster Hunt territory. According to some versions of the legend, La Llorona never really became confused as the years went by. Instead, her spirit became bitter and angry. She came to the conclusion that her children, being innocent, were already with God and she would never find them because they weren't on earth to begin with. Maria would never cross over. She was handed a punishment by heaven instead of hell, turned away at the gates through a lie that she believed for hundreds of years. Out of pure spite and fury, she now slaughters anybody that she comes across, especially children and younger men, seeing both as the source of all of her suffering. Methods of killing range from drowning and stabbing to even maiming and devouring children at the most extreme. The version of the story involving Doña Marina claims she killed the children that she had with Cortez because an Aztec god came to her in a vision, claiming that if she let Cortez take the children back to Spain, one of them would eventually return as a general and commit genocide against her people. Other variants come to the conclusion that Maria witnessed a wedding between Cortez and a Spanish woman of high standing who was even younger than her. This version of the tale also shows up in stories that aren't about Doña Marina and Cortez. No matter what, the whipping woman really does have a lot to cry about, and it's no wonder that her spirit is restless. Sometimes violent, sometimes begging for mercy to God, but always wandering the coast of South America's rivers, lakes, and oceans, La Llorona is still sighted to this day, traveling in her old white dress, her tear-stained face obscured by long, black hair. Parents tell the story to their children to keep them from staying outside after dark, and to keep them from visiting places they can drown without adult supervision. Children tell it to other kids to scare the hell out of them. People tell it to each other to keep the legend alive. After all, a story is a deep tradition that's even older than the American tale of the Headless Horseman. Sightings of La Llorona apparently stretch all the way back to the late 1500s. But at the end of our visit at this first hunting ground, one thing is clear. There are so many versions of the story that it's best to just stick away from La Llorona if you do see her. There's no way of putting this ghost to rest, and no guaranteed way of approaching or fending her off. Eventually, Maria might find the mercy she's looking for, but it's nothing that we can offer. Let's not test whether or not she's become angry now instead of sad. We don't have any time for drowning lessons on the riverbank. Next up is everybody's favorite monster, because this one can show up pretty much anywhere at any time. It can be at your job, your school, lurking behind a tree on the side of a road in your town, in your backyard, hiding in the bathroom in your house right now, especially if you're watching this on the toilet. Your shower curtain is open, right? If it's not, don't investigate. Your death right now would be very funny. And that's exactly what killer clowns are looking for. Yep, that's right, we're finally doing it here on Nightmind. Killer clowns, colorophobia, fear of the laughing white-faced psycho. It's happening, I'm doing it. And why is it happening? Because it's everywhere. Just like it's always been, actually. But especially now. The new It movie, the killer clown theme in the new season of American Horror Story, the clown sighting epidemic last year that claimed they were lurking around in the woods. You can't get away from this. But nobody ever really has been able to get away from this. Not for a long time. The roots of the clown stem from the jester and harlequin, both of whom have always played trickster roles in their places of origin and the literature they were involved in. These have actually never really been morally good characters, and a book by researcher Ben Radford, Bad Clowns, has shed a lot of light on the subject, revealing that the reputation of the clown as a carefree, morally gray wildcard has always been that way, until American reinvention. Mascot characters like Ronald McDonald were pushed as happy, good, friendly clowns associated with very positive things, which really helped out the modern version of the circus, which had been trying to do that for decades, but couldn't pull it off because they were lacking constant major media exposure. But even at this time, characters like the Joker in Batman comics, who made his appearance in the 1940s, were doing what some darker takes on jesters and harlequins had always done, albeit with a more pointed and evil intention, making it hard for people trying to rebrand the clown as a family-friendly, morally good character to succeed. Things really came crashing to a halt with the arrest of John Wayne Gacy, one of America's most infamous and shockingly deadly serial killers, who tortured and murdered at least 33 young men and boys during the 1970s. Gacy was known as a real family man and friendly neighbor who dressed up as a character of his own creation, Pogo the Clown, making appearances at children's parties, parades, and fundraisers. The media already was having a major bonfire with coverage of the Gacy case. The Pogo angle tossed a lot of gasoline on it and kept it burning for years, right up to the release of Stephen King's novel, It, in 1986. The appearance of Pennywise and the meteoric rise in popularity of the Joker really sealed the fate on the dual nature of the clown in the American psyche. But here's the deal. Pennywise never needed to show up for things to start getting very, very odd when it came to the idea of scary clowns. You will all remember, I'm sure, the clown sighting pandemic I've just mentioned from 2016. Just another moment of the year 2016 being absolutely insane with the loss of reality drunk at the wheel, right? No. Apparently, this exact sort of thing has been happening for a disturbingly long time. In May of 1981, an all-points bulletin went out asking police officers in Brookline, Massachusetts to keep an eye out on the roads for an old van containing a bunch of clowns. Many children at Brookline's Lawrence Elementary School had reported seeing it, claiming that the clowns had tried to lure them into the van and said they had candy. Reports were serious enough that the Boston Globe wrote an article informing the masses. In the same month, police in Kansas City, Missouri were dealing with their own clown issue, receiving reports that children at different local schools had been chased by a clown wielding a knife who drove a yellow van. The original article that ran in United Press International reads, "We don't want to panic people, to make them think there's an Atlanta-type situation here," said Kansas City Police Sergeant Jim Treese. But today we have the first sighting of this clown that has been verifiable. Although many children at 6 Kansas City, Kansas schools had reported seeing the clown driving a yellow van since Monday, a police spokesman said that no adults had reported seeing him until Friday morning. Treese said 2 sisters, 6 and 7 years old, were confronted at 8:30 a.m. Friday while walking to their school bus in Kansas City. The mother, watching from the porch, saw a yellow van pull up to the girls, Treese said. Moments later, the children ran screaming back to their mother and the van sped off. The woman told Treese her children said a man dressed as a clown had pointed a knife at them and ordered them to get into the van. The dark-haired man was wearing a clown outfit and had a painted face with red polka dots, the woman told Treese. Reports also came in a month later from Pittsburgh, though police claimed the evidence and reports weren't exactly solid. By this time, the news was getting around in enough places where the sighting seemed to be legitimate that children could overhear and, of course, file false reports. So that's 2 major breakouts of evil clowns in separate places within 1 month. In May of 1981, 5 years before Stephen King's It was released as a novel. What about after Pennywise hit the scene? That's when things really began to bubble. And again, all at once, in October of 1991, starting in Erie, Pennsylvania, when about 40 children and even some adults reported a clown sneaking around in yards and looking into houses through windows. This preceded the hysteria that gripped Chicago around October 11, 1991, which has enough documentation and adults who swear by it even today that it bears taking a look at seriously. In the early 90s, there was a show on Fox called In Living Color. It's where the song Cult of Personality comes from if you've ever heard it. In Living Color was a sketch comedy show with music segments, similar to Saturday Night Live, which featured a skit about an apathetic clown named Homie, who would take out his misfortune on children at parties by hitting them with a heavy sock. Reports came in to Chicago police about a clown dressed up like Homie trying to lure children into his van with candy and money, showing up outside of Irving School on South Kohler Ave. There were variations in the reports about the van and its color. White, red, or blue were mentioned, and some said it was a black pickup truck. Some even mentioned an old ice cream van. Sightings poured in from all over the city, with many coming around the same time in different locations. Some people were beginning to suspect that there was actually more than one clown. You can check online to find evidence of people who were kids at that time reporting their experience. One article on Chicago Reader's website in October of 2006 by Isaiah Thompson stirred up a lot of memories in the comments section. Isaiah, I was attending Congress Park Elementary at this time, same grade, and trust me, we heard all about Homie. Our legend involved a white ice cream truck, and the kids he killed were dismembered and stuck in the freezer, then dumped in the canal. To this day, I don't approach an ice cream truck with my 8-year-old unless I'm suitably ready to defend myself, despite living on the West Coast. Call it a childhood scar that runs deep and may never heal. I remember Homie the Clown, because I was chased by him or an impersonator. That's why I just googled the clown, because at the time I was a 6th grader who lived on the south side of Chicago. I spotted the van one evening parked outside of Kosminski Elementary in Chicago's Hyde Park community. It was a white utility van, and the clown costume was real. Homie was told to lure children there with candy, then kidnap, rape, and possibly kill them. I'm not sure if it was a legend and some sicko decided to add to the terror the news and school warnings possessed inside of us. But what I do know is, Homie the Clown at that time was very real to little boys and girls of that era. My Homie the Clown experience was most definitely real, even though the police at that time said it was probably an imposter. The chasing by the clown man in the van was very traumatizing and affected me for a long time after the incident. And to this day, whenever I'm in that neighborhood, I find myself getting the chills and looking for that van. I was in the 5th grade in Portage Park. A clown threw some candy in the street and tried to lure me and my friend into his white van. We ran home as fast as we could, crying to my mom. She told me I made it up to scare my younger sister. Years later, she told me she believed me, because shortly after that she got letters from school about sightings. This is true. I was in 3rd or 4th grade when it happened. He was trying to lure me off my cousin's porch with a balloon. He said everything was okay and that he was trying to give out free balloons. There was a white van parked nearby. I almost walked off the porch towards him, but I got a weird feeling. I couldn't understand why he was out there near the park by himself giving out balloons and there were no other kids out there. At the time, I hadn't heard about the Homie the Clown story, so I had no reason to be frightened, but common sense kicked in to let me know something wasn't right. This is not an urban legend. This was real. I went to Madison Elementary School in South Holland. I remember us being so scared of this so-called clown. I think we even stayed in one Halloween because we thought he was going to strike. A friend said she saw the van passing her house. I always wondered if this was true. There are other comments on this article sharing their stories, claiming personal encounters with Homie. Some of them even mention them being more recent, claiming that there were sightings in 2007. There's even a local Chicago news article from their NBC affiliate in October of 2008 talking about clown sightings. Mass hysteria, hoaxes, false reports, or actual attacks. In my personal opinion, I think you have all of that in one. People have been arrested wearing the clown costumes while trying to cause trouble for the public, while others have been revealed as just getting in on the action. As for things like Homie the Clown, it's easy to see that someone could have driven around with a clown act trying to kidnap children, and the first person to remark that it was Homie from In Living Color just made the moniker stick. Something that's hard to accept is the notion that all of the clown sightings that happened in cities years before Stephen King's novel It came out were false. That just doesn't seem possible. It's also tough to believe that many of these were hoaxes spurred by John Wayne Gacy's character Pogo. But even if they were, even if the clown sightings were people dressing up after being inspired by Pogo, that still says a lot about the activity. Suppose the events in May of 1981 were precisely that. Men inspired by John Wayne Gacy to dress up as a killer clown and scare children. This was 1981. No internet, no wildfire media for small-town stories, no mainstream ideas about killer clowns or urban legends like this. It had to be a pretty sick mind to think about doing something like that and commit to it with no major media exposure. Usually the kind of mind who actually does engage in violent and twisted behavior behind closed doors, or is slowly working its way to the point of giving in to twisted desires and evil feelings. A copycat killer is still a murderer. It doesn't matter that they're a rip-off act if they're still making bodies. We're not going to escape the evil clown archetype. It's attractive in its cynical darkness, blending happy feelings with bitter poison. Human beings have been attracted to that twisted approach to horror and storytelling forever, and it's never going to stop. Most clowns are good clowns, and yes, they're going to have a rough time with mainstream stigma, but social consciousness can't so easily remove what it naturally creates time and time again. Just keep on marching, good clowns. We still appreciate you. Just let us have our psycho homies and killer pogos in October, our jokers and Pennywise characters, and we'll do our best to keep the poison cotton candy separate from the real deal. Now we turn to an area that's a little bit easier to manage for our search party compared to, the whole country. Although I wouldn't be a bit surprised to learn that this tale may have spread beyond the Northeast. You can hear whispers of the story in places like New Jersey and parts of New England, but mainly, New York State is where we're most likely to find what we're after. Anyone familiar with the name Cropsy who isn't a New York native has probably heard of him through a documentary by that title from 2009, detailing the investigation into an urban legend on Staten Island. If they didn't pick it up from there, they may have heard of him through the related documentary by the same director, Killer Legends, which references the Cropsy film as the inspiration for investigating more stories of hidden monsters. In both documentaries, the investigation deals with Cropsy as a local legend that really only exists on Staten Island. The tale claims that Cropsy was an escaped patient from Willowbrook State School, a very real abandoned mental hospital that the creators of American Horror Story have cited as the inspiration for Briarcliff Manor in Season 2. The local news investigation in 1972 that exposed its extreme amount of neglect, abuse, and pure horror movie conditions resulted in the state shutting it down. The format of this report, called Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace, is extremely similar to the report made by investigator Lana Winters in American Horror Story Asylum. Kids on Staten Island were told to never go exploring inside the abandoned old mental hospital because a former inmate named Cropsy was still living there, hiding out in the empty buildings and the tunnel system underneath. He was a child abductor and murderer, always on the lookout for new victims, and was said to have the infamous hook for a hand, which he'd use to catch and kill you. At night is when he really liked to look for victims, stalking the graffiti-painted halls in hopes of finding adventurous young people who weren't afraid of big bad Cropsy. The documentary from 2009 is a pretty great piece for learning about the Cropsy of Staten Island, as well as a very eerie coinciding case of a child abductor and murderer with ties to the legend that will shock viewers. But for all of its reporting, the Cropsy documentary kind of drops the ball when it comes to investigating the story of Cropsy, because Cropsy, as it turns out, is not from Staten Island, and he certainly did not start with Willowbrook State School. He's a much older, much more widespread urban legend, whose recorded roots have their very own surprises. In the documentary, there's heavy insinuation that the tale of Cropsy on Staten Island was actually fueled by the alleged crimes of Andre Rand, a serial child abductor and killer who's believed to be responsible for the disappearance of 5 children on the island. 4 of them were taken within the span of 7 years in the same general area, while the 5th disappeared quite a distance from the others and was taken 9 years before heavy activity began. Alice was kidnapped in 1972, while Holly Ann, who signals the beginning of major serial killer hunting behavior, was abducted in 1981. Doing a bit of research on Cropsy online turns up a really excellent reference point. An article from a quarterly magazine called New York Folklore from 1977 titled The Cropsy Maniac. The authors of the article, Lee Herring and Mark Breslerman, spent a few years collecting stories about Cropsy from all around New York State, and they found that the majority of them dealt with campgrounds rather than abandoned buildings. The New York Folklore article dives deep, exploring a lot of variations on the tale and citing its interview sources by names and ages of those interviewed. As far as actual writing on Cropsy goes, this is the most visible piece out there. Really, it's the only visible piece out there you can actually find as major reference material. Believe me, I've looked, and everything comes back to the Herring and Breslerman article as the source. They very well might have been the first people to collect and write down the story and its variations. So, let's take a look for a second at the activity map for Andre Rand's suspected victims and the release of the Cropsy Maniac in New York Folklore. The published article predates major activity related to Andre Rand through criminal trial convictions by 4 years. Holly Ann, victim number 1 of major activity, was taken in the year 1981, and the New York Folklore article was published in 1977. That still leaves Alice in 1972 as potential evidence for Andre Rand being the real Cropsy though, right? She predates the article by 7 years after all. Then let's pretend for a moment that despite the major lapse in reported activity between Alice and Holly Ann, Andre really did start making a mark on police radar with Alice by abducting her in 1972. We still have evidence provided by Herring and Breslerman that completely eviscerates the notion Andre Rand had anything to do with the start of the Cropsy legend. At the end of the article from 1977 that appeared in New York Folklore, we have an appendix that says, the following text, in addition to the excerpts included in the Cropsy Maniac, were collected by Mark Breslerman in the fall of 1966. Breslerman's questions appear in parentheses. Informant data is not given here, as it has already been furnished in the article itself. The first piece of the appendix is an interview conducted with Diane Spiegel Horowitz, which, as we've just established, was collected in fall of 1966 by Mark Breslerman. As Diane begins her story, Mark asks her, "Roscoe is the town the camp you attended is located in, isn't it?" To which she replies, "Yes." In the article itself, when Diane is first mentioned, she is described as a 33-year-old graduate at Cortland State Teachers College. So at age 33, in the year 1966, Diane is providing information about Cropsy that she learned in the past while at camp in Roscoe, which means that at the time, she had to be young enough to be attending the camp in some capacity. If we give even the heaviest bit of legroom and assume that she was an adult camp counselor as late as that very year, we still have the report of Richard Banks, age 22 from West Long Branch, New Jersey, who said that he learned the story as a Boy Scout, and Joan Kaplan, age 16, who heard it as an 11-year-old pupil at Brooklyn Ethical Culture School. So Joan Kaplan, age 16 in the year 1966, having heard it 5 years before at age 11, brings us the year 1961 as a period of time in which the Cropsy legend was being passed around. If we assume Diane Horowitz was young enough to be a camper or counselor in her early 20s when she heard the story in Roscoe, then we're looking at the Cropsy story being told even as far back as the early 1950s. But no matter what, the fact that most of Breslerman's information comes from 1966 puts us way ahead of Andre Rand's suspected first strike in 1972, and the wide reach of Cropsy's legend going around stretches far beyond Staten Island. Like I said, it was a nice documentary, and Andre Rand may have become the Cropsy of Staten Island through his actions, but he was absolutely not the inspiration for the tale. The tale just mutated when it hit Staten Island to involve a local scary asylum and an even scarier man. So now that we've cleared all that up, what are we looking at when it comes to the actual Cropsy legend? Again, it depends on where you heard it and who told it, but just like La Llorona, it has a solid plot line that never really changes. Most of the storytellers say that George Cropsy was a very respected judge. Others say that he was a city councilman who owned a store. Some people agree he did own a store, but that was in the past, because he was a retired businessman. In every variation of the story, Cropsy loses a child at the hands of reckless younger people, usually at a camp or very close to a camp. Often, it's a camp counselor or older teen camper who is responsible for the death. Sometimes his wife is also killed, but in every story, George Cropsy, respected, gentle member of the community, loses a child because of reckless younger people. Stricken by grief and rage, George Cropsy goes insane. His hair turns white and he lets it grow as madness takes over, resembling the styles of much older judges in much older times, but unkempt and wild, flowing over his shoulders. He gets a weapon, sometimes an axe, quite often a knife, occasionally a hatchet or cleaver, and then goes on a journey of revenge, finding and killing teenagers at the location where his child or family died. A girl is found stabbed at the same spot as the previous action. After a police search, a second girl is stabbed in the same place. A girl student is found stabbed in the woods near the school. After an attempt at capture, a second girl student is stabbed walking with a friend who survives to say that George Cropsy was the killer. A hiking camper is stabbed in the area of the previous action. A card with the name Cropsy is found next to the body. On another hike, he is discovered stabbing a second camper. After the stabbing of a third, a man is seen limping away and another Cropsy card is found near the body. A camper is found stabbed in the woods with his face burned. Written in blood on his stomach is the name Cropsy. The maniac is discovered one night laughing hysterically and stabbing a third camper to death. A girl camper is found stabbed in the woods. Within sight of a counselor, Cropsy strangles another girl. A child from his daughter's camping bunk is found stabbed. Another is found with a knife in her chest and a pillow covering her face to muffle her screams. A boy at the same bungalow colony is found dead in the road, his head run over by a car. A second boy is stabbed. One night at about 3 a.m, one of the counselors was awakened by the screams of one of his campers. He put his flashlight in the direction of the screams and saw his camper bleeding to death. And, standing over him, a man with chalk-white hair, red bloodshot eyes, and swinging a long, bloody axe. And on it goes. A story of tragedy, madness, rage, and bloody, hateful vengeance taken out on the innocent. Normally kind and gentle parent of the community loses their child, usually at camp. Parent loses their mind. Parent goes on wild path of murder as revenge for their child, slaughtering countless teenagers and young adults. Does this sound familiar to you? Does this remind you of any famous stories that you might have heard before? Maybe a really famous, really well-established, and long-running franchise? Just wait. I am about to blow your mind. I was ecstatic to have the full Cropsy Maniac folklore article when I found it. I read through the stories feeling really satisfied, knowing I had something great. And, like many of you right now, I kept on getting it in my head that this sounded a lot like the story of a particular movie. Actually, a very celebrated series of horror movies that gets paraded around every October. And then I got into reading Diane Horowitz's account of the Cropsy story, and struck bloody, screaming horror gold. You'll remember that this article came out in 1977, containing information that was from 1966 when the interview with Diane Horowitz, age 33, took place, who claimed to have heard the story when she was at camp in Roscoe, New York, which was most likely sometime in the early 1950s. The name of the site where Diane heard the story when she first learned about Cropsy? Crystal Lake Camp. It was Camp Crystal Lake. Here's the full version of Diane's account with Mark Breslerman in the fall of 1966. George Cropsy was one of the best-liked men in Roscoe. He owned a large hardware store and was on the city council. Cropsy had a wife and child, and they were all he lived for. One day, the wife and child went up to the camp to visit the owner with whom they were very friendly. While Mrs. Cropsy was talking with the owner, her child was given permission to go boating in the lake with one of the campers. There was some fooling around on the lake. The child fell from the boat and was drowned. When Mrs. Cropsy heard the tragic news, she went into immediate shock. George Cropsy was called to the camp and told of the tragedy. He just stared into space when told. He didn't say a word. At the child's funeral, he didn't speak. For days following, he wouldn't speak to anyone, wouldn't visit his wife in the hospital, just wasn't acting human at all. Finally, one day, he disappeared. Shortly after Mrs. Cropsy's death, one of the campers at Crystal Lake was found to be missing. By the first night of her disappearance, the entire camp was panicking. The police were called in, her parents were notified, and search parties were organized. She couldn't be found in the area, so they decided to drag the lake. After several hours, her body was found. The name Cropsy was burned on her arm. The police swore in several deputies, and an all-out search for George Cropsy was begun. One night, at about 2 in the morning, one of the counselors was awoken by the smell of smoke. He looked out his cabin window and saw that the neighboring cabin was on fire. He woke up as many people as he could and tried to do everything possible to save the campers and counselors of the burning cabin. His efforts were futile. 2 counselors and 7 campers burned to death. On the ground in the middle of the campus, the words "Cropsy's Revenge" were seen written in flour. State troopers, local police, and all Roscoe residents now joined in the search of George Cropsy. Several nights a week, small fires were started in the woods, and people were known to hear the sound of a shrieking, dreadful laughter. One night, while a search party was out checking the area, one of the members of the group saw a man kneeling to start a fire. He shot at him and hit him in the leg. The man began limping towards the lake, and they followed after him. He got on a wooden rowboat and started rowing across the lake. They fired into the boat and it began to sink. They saw the man going under, but as he sank, they heard the words, "Cropsy's revenge shall not be denied." The lake was dragged once again, but no body could be found. The men in the searching party swore that he went under, and he could not possibly have lived. The file on George Cropsy was left open, but he was presumed to be dead. His body, however, was never found. For the remainder of that summer and for the next 2 summers after that, strange noises accompanied by a low, terrifying laughter were heard in the woods surrounding the lake. And there it is. As open, shocking, and unmistakable as you can get, Cropsy is not just an urban legend. He is the inspiration behind a much more famous tale we celebrate every Halloween. Cropsy is the original Pamela Voorhees and her son Jason after that, the very root of the Friday the 13th franchise. The timeline adds up too. In 1977 we got the article for the Cropsy Maniac. In 1980 we received the first Friday the 13th film, the plot of which mimics the Cropsy story told by an attendant of a real Crystal Lake camp in New York beat for beat. You can even find vintage postcards for sale on Amazon and eBay that verify the existence of the camp. And while we're on the topic, Friday the 13th isn't the only movie inspired by Cropsy that came out. It just seems to be the one that didn't admit where the story came from. There was a film called The Burning in 1981 that dealt with Cropsy by name, and one titled Madman in 1982, which was apparently also about Cropsy, but had to change the name and a few details after learning about The Burning, which was in production at the same time. And guess who worked on the monster makeup design for Cropsy in The Burning? Tom Savini, the very same man who did the makeup design for Jason Voorhees in Friday the 13th. Campsite serial killers seem to have been around for a long time, far before Jason Voorhees. Cropsy. It has always been Cropsy. I'm still amazed at the turn of events. I haven't had a moment of discovery as awesome as reading the name Crystal Lake Camp in that article from 1977 for a while. We got a lot more than we expected on this hunt. Like the legend of La Llorona, there's no real way of knowing if the story comes from true events in any way. I'm definitely willing to believe that innocent campers have been killed before by a madman. It's way too easy to expect as something bad that could happen to you while out in the wild. This world can be a very scary and unpredictable place. Crazy and unexpected seems to be the rule more often lately than the exception, and as we've seen tonight, it's a pretty small world after all. Lots of weeping women, lots of killer clowns, and plenty of Cropsies with different weapons and hideouts, from abandoned mental hospitals to quiet campsites on the lake. There are many variations on these tales, but all seem to boil down to their own unique archetypes, and all 3 are very welcome in the Monster Hunt trophy case. I'd call tonight a successful journey, but I'm only happy if you guys are. Tell me down below what you thought about our trip into the bloodier, more haunted side of reality tonight, and which one of our targets freaked you out the most. And again, if you haven't been on the first tour, you might find there's plenty more to see with Monster Hunt 1. That's all for tonight. I've got to get home and prepare for this year's real main event on the biggest night of the year. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know by hitting the like button and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more content exploring the darker side of the universe, where we'll be turning up more ghosts, monsters, and murderers all year long. Thanks to all of you for watching, and major thanks to all of my supporters on Patreon, who made it possible to get such up-close and plentiful footage of our targets tonight. Really, this was only something I was able to do with your backing, and I appreciate it immensely. Thank you for giving me the support needed to make this October as big as it's turned out to be. If any of you would like to help contribute to next year's event and make it even crazier, consider becoming a patron. Even just $1 a month goes a long way towards bringing monsters to life on Nightmind and giving new creators a chance to shine. Stick around to the end of this video to see the names of all the creatures of the night who have become patrons. That's all for now, everyone. Thanks for joining me in the dark again this evening. Once more, I'm Nick Nocturne, and like the psycho clowns and campsite killers lurking in the woods near your home, I'll be seeing you again real soon. Sleep tight.